The desert was never kind, and that day it seemed determined to swallow her whole. The sun had vanished hours earlier, hidden behind a wall of yellow-brown fury that stretched across the horizon like the edge of the world. Grains of sand hissed through the air, stinging her face, clawing at her hair, and filling her mouth with grit whenever she opened her lips to cry out. She had been walking for what felt like forever, stumbling over ridges of shifting dunes, trying to remember the direction she had come from. But the storm turned the desert into a spinning cage, erasing every trace of her footprints the moment they were made. Her name was Claire. She had thought herself brave. When she wandered beyond the caravan's camp to search for water, convinced she could find a spring her father once spoke of. But the desert cared nothing for bravery, and the storm had risen with terrifying speed. One moment she had seen the pale outlines of wagons and canvas tents behind her. The next they were gone, swallowed in the whirl of dust and wind. She pulled her scarf over her nose, but her lungs still burned, and each breath came harsher than the last. The sand wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside her, cutting, choking, tearing at her hope. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and pressed her hands into the hot, coarse ground. Tears blurred her eyes, though she didn't know if it was grief or the sand itself. All she could think was that she would die out here alone, buried under the dunes like so many lost travelers before her. She thought of her mother, of the promise she'd made to return with fresh water, and the thought broke her. She lowered her head, whispering a prayer into the howling storm, not sure if heaven or hell could hear her. But then, faint through the chaos, came something else, a sound different from the storm. A voice low and steady carried on the wind. At first she thought it was her mind inventing comfort, but then she heard it again, strong, certain, calling her back from the edge. She turned, eyes burning, and through the curtain of flying sand she saw him. The cowboy came out of the storm like a figure pulled from legend. His broad hat was pulled low against the wind, his leather coat snapping behind him like the wing of some wild bird. His face was half shielded by a scarf, but his eyes, sharp, clear, unyielding, found hers instantly. He moved with purpose, each step steady against the shifting dunes, as if the storm itself parted to let him through. In that moment, she could have sworn she was staring at salvation given flesh. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice carrying over the roar. "Don't move." But Claire could barely keep her balance. The storm shoved at her like a living thing, tearing her off her knees. She felt herself sliding down the side of the dune, fear screaming in her chest. And then his hand was there, rough, strong, and unshakable, closing around her arm before she could fall further. He pulled her to her feet, with the kind of strength that didn't ask for thanks, only demanded trust. "Stay close," he said, leaning in so she could hear. His eyes held hers with such certainty she found herself nodding without question. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, how he had found her, if anyone else from the caravan had survived, but the storm was too fierce for words. Instead, she gripped his hand tightly, letting him lead her. Step by step, he guided her against the invisible current of the storm. His figure never faltered, his movements unhurried but sure, like a man who had wrestled the desert before and never lost. Claire fought to keep up, her legs heavy as lead, her lungs raw from the grit. The cowboy never let go. Even when she stumbled, he caught her weight without breaking stride, as though he had expected her to falter and was ready for it. His hand was a lifeline, the one real thing in a world gone mad with swirling sand and endless emptiness. She thought again of her mother, of the wagons, of the people she might never see again, and despair rose hot in her throat. But the cowboy glanced back at her, eyes flashing with something more than determination. It was a promise, silent but unbreakable. "I'll get you out." And against all reason, she believed him. The storm howled on, endless, merciless. Time lost all meaning. But as long as she felt the grip of his hand, Claire knew she was not lost anymore. When the sandstorm finally broke, it was not with sudden silence, but with the slow loosening of the desert's grip. The wind began to fade, the sky overhead shifting from a seething brown haze into pale streaks of gold and gray. The dunes stopped boiling and stood still again, though the air still carried the sharp taste of dust. Claire leaned heavily on the cowboy's arm, her body trembling from exhaustion, her throat raw and lips cracked. It felt like waking from a nightmare only to find herself on the edge of another. He lowered her gently against the leeward side of a dune, out of the worst of the lingering wind. His scarf was dust-stained, his hat crusted with grit, but his eyes, though steady, Unyielding eyes remained sharp and alert, scanning the horizon as if danger could rise from anywhere. "You're safe," he said simply. His voice carried no flourish, no false comfort, just fact. And for some reason, that was more reassuring than any sweet promise could have been. Claire struggled to form words, coughing before they came. The caravan," she rasped. "My family. We have to go back." He knelt beside her, pulling a canteen from his pack. The water inside was warm, almost bitter with sand, but it was life. She drank greedily, the liquid burning down her parched throat. Only when she pulled away did he answer. "The storm swallowed everything behind us. You'd never find him in that mess." His tone wasn't cruel, just blunt, like a man who had no use for lies. "Best thing now is to keep moving forward. Out here you stand still, you die." His words cut into her chest, but not as deep as the fear already planted there. She wiped her mouth, staring at him with wide, pleading eyes. "You don't understand. My mother, my little brother, they're back there. If I don't—" He reached out, firm but steady, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Listen, I know what it is to lose folks. I ain't asking you to forget 'em, but the desert don't give second chances. You walk back in there, storm will take you same as it tried to already. Only way you'll help 'em is by staying alive yourself." Tears stung her eyes, hot and blinding. She hated him for his certainty. Hated that his logic made sense when all her heart screamed was to turn back. Yet the weight of his hand on her shoulder grounded her, kept her from running headlong into death. She nodded, though it felt like betrayal. The cowboy stood, brushing the sand from his coat. "Name's Colt," he said, as if offering his name could steady her further. "You can curse it later if you want, but for now, it's the one keeping you alive." "Claire," she whispered. The name felt fragile on her tongue, almost lost in the wind. "Good. Means I know what to call you when you start wandering. Off." His mouth curved in the faintest ghost of a smile, though his eyes stayed hard. "Now get up. Long way yet before we find shelter." Claire forced her legs beneath her, clumsy and weak. She wanted to sink back into the sand, let the earth claim her, but something in Colt's presence, some mixture of command and quiet faith, drew her forward. He offered his hand again, and when she took it, the storm inside her heart eased just enough to let her stand. They walked for what felt like hours, though time had no clear shape in the desert. The horizon stretched forever, dunes rising and falling like waves on a silent sea. With every step, Claire felt smaller, more insignificant, swallowed by the endless expanse. Yet Colt's steady stride anchored her. He moved like a man who had memorized the language of sand and wind, one who could read the desert's secrets with a glance. At last, as the sun began to tilt lower, its glare softening into a molten orange, Colt stopped and pointed. In the distance, nestled between two ridges of stone, lay a cluster of weathered posts and tattered canvas. To Claire's exhausted eyes, it looked like a miracle. "Old way station," Colt said. "Not much left of it, but might be enough to get us through the night." By the time they reached it, Claire could barely stand. The outpost was little more than a half-collapsed shack, its roof sagging under years of storms. But inside, the air was still and the shade felt like a blessing. Colt spread his pack on the floor, pulling out what little supplies he had: a strip of dried meat, another canteen, and a small bundle of matches. He worked with quiet efficiency, sparking a tiny fire in the corner while Claire sat trembling, hugging her knees. She watched him, struck by the calm in his movements. He did not waste energy, did not hurry, did not falter. He was the kind of man who belonged to places like this, hard, enduring, unshaken by desolation. Why did you come for me?" she asked finally, her voice small in the silence. Colt looked up, his expression unreadable in the fire's glow. For a long moment he didn't answer, just poked at the tiny flame until it caught on a strip of wood. Then he said simply, "Because no one should die alone in the sand?" The words hit her harder than she expected. Simple, brutal, true. She turned her gaze to the fire, letting its warmth soak into her aching bones. For the first time since the storm had risen, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Not safety, not certainty, but hope, fragile and precious. And she knew it had less to do with the fire than with the man who had pulled her through the storm and refused to let go of her hand.